From the moment Tyrion Lannister is born into the world of Game of Thrones, rejection is not an experience he encounters later in life, but a defining condition of his existence. He does not grow into exclusion. He is introduced to it as a birthright. His physical difference transforms what should have been a noble inheritance into a psychological burden, forcing him to exist in contradiction to the expectations of lineage and legacy that surround him. Within his own family, belonging is replaced by tolerance, and tolerance by resentment. The absence of warmth from his father establishes a foundational emotional void, teaching him early that approval is neither guaranteed nor freely given. Instead of receiving unconditional acceptance, he is met with suspicion and disappointment, which subtly communicates that his value must be earned rather than assumed. This dynamic disrupts the natural development of self-worth. Rather than forming confidence through affirmation, Tyrion learns to construct identity through resistance. He begins to understand himself, not as someone who belongs, but as someone who must justify his presence. His sister's hostility intensifies this process, reinforcing the perception that even shared blood does not ensure solidarity. Family becomes less a source of protection and more a mirror reflecting society's broader disdain. As he matures, social interactions beyond the family replicate this pattern. Politeness masks contempt, and laughter often carries the undertone of mockery. Each encounter subtly reinforces the belief that acceptance is conditional and temporary. Over time, rejection ceases to feel like an external act and becomes internalized as expectation. He anticipates dismissal before it occurs, preparing emotionally for outcomes that may not yet exist. This anticipation leads to hyper-awareness. He becomes adept at interpreting tone, gesture, and silence, constantly scanning for signs of judgment. Rather than collapsing under these pressures, he adapts by cultivating intellect as an alternative form of legitimacy. Knowledge becomes the domain where physical difference holds no authority. Yet this adaptation carries tension. His confidence remains dependent on performance, requiring continuous validation through competence. Thus, identity forms not through belonging but through endurance, shaped by the necessity of surviving in an environment where acceptance is perpetually uncertain. In order to exist within a world that consistently denies his legitimacy, Tyrion Lannister develops a network of psychological defenses that function not merely as coping strategies, but as essential tools for survival in the social and political environment of Game of Thrones. Humor becomes his most refined and visible shield, allowing him to transform potential humiliation into controlled performance. By directing ridicule toward himself before others can do so, he removes its destructive power and reframes mockery as intentional expression rather than imposed degradation. This self-directed humor does more than entertain. It establishes psychological distance between his inner self and the external judgments imposed upon him. The laughter he generates becomes a boundary that protects vulnerability from direct assault. Alongside humor emerges cynicism, which evolves into a philosophical stance shaped by repeated disappointment. Expecting betrayal becomes safer than anticipating loyalty, and pessimism becomes a form of emotional insurance. This worldview reduces the shock of rejection, but also narrows the possibility of genuine trust. Relationships are approached with calculation rather than openness, as emotional investment is perceived as a risk rather than a reward. Detachment follows naturally from this orientation. By limiting emotional exposure, he minimizes the potential for psychological injury. Yet this detachment creates an internal paradox. While it protects him from pain, it also reinforces loneliness. Safety is achieved at the cost of intimacy. Alcohol serves as an auxiliary mechanism, dulling the relentless vigilance required to maintain these defenses. In moments of intoxication, he briefly escapes the necessity of constant self-awareness. However, these moments offer only temporary relief, often followed by heightened sensitivity to isolation once clarity returns. His interactions therefore oscillate between connection and withdrawal, shaped by the tension between longing and self-protection. Romantic relationships reveal the limits of these defenses. When affection appears sincere, it threatens the stability of the emotional barriers he has constructed. Love introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty challenges the predictability upon which his survival depends. Even in leadership roles, his empathy reflects the influence of rejection. Having experienced marginalization, he recognizes vulnerability in others. Yet this empathy exposes him to disappointment when compassion is not reciprocated. Ultimately, his emotional survival depends on maintaining a fragile balance between guardedness and openness, ensuring functionality without surrendering entirely to isolation. For most of his life, rejection functions as an emotional verdict against Tyrion's worth, shaping not only how others see him, but how he interprets himself. However, one of the most profound psychological shifts in his journey occurs when rejection stops being experienced solely as personal failure and begins to be understood as social information. This transition marks the beginning of his transformation. Instead of asking why he is unworthy of acceptance, he begins to question the values of those who deny it. The source of judgment becomes as important as the judgment itself, allowing him to recognize that exclusion often reflects the limitations of the rejecter rather than the inadequacy of the rejected. This realization gradually weakens the internal authority of voices that once defined his identity. The contempt he endured no longer feels like an objective truth, but rather a subjective perspective shaped by fear, tradition, and prejudice. Through this reframing, rejection transforms from an existential condemnation into a social signal. It reveals more about the structure of power than about his intrinsic value. His outsider status becomes a unique vantage point. Because he has never been fully absorbed into dominant systems, he is able to observe their inconsistencies and fragility. Power, once perceived as an unquestionable force, begins to appear as performance, sustained by belief rather than legitimacy. This awareness alters his relationship with authority. Instead of seeking entry into exclusive circles, he becomes capable of operating alongside them without internalizing their standards. Validation shifts from external approval to internal coherence. He no longer measures his worth through acceptance, but through alignment with his own evolving principles. Failure and humiliation begin to lose their catastrophic weight. Rather than confirming inferiority, they become experiences that expand strategic understanding. Empathy deepens alongside this transformation. Having endured marginalization, he recognizes vulnerability in others and understands that suffering is rarely distributed according to merit. This recognition allows him to approach leadership not as domination, but as responsibility. He begins to value justice over prestige and stability over recognition, reflecting a shift from defensive survival to intentional action. Belonging, once pursued desperately, becomes less central to his sense of self. He accepts that acceptance may remain uncertain without equating that uncertainty with inadequacy. Identity becomes increasingly self-authored. The narrative imposed upon him loses its authority as he constructs meaning independently. Rejection no longer defines his boundaries, but informs his perception. It sharpens his ability to navigate social dynamics without being consumed by them. The experience that once confined him evolves into a lens through which he interprets human behavior and institutional power. Through this process, he transforms rejection from a wound into a source of insight. Rather than escaping marginalization, he integrates it into a broader understanding of the world. In doing so, he achieves a form of autonomy that does not depend on inclusion. He remains marked by exclusion, but no longer governed by it. The outsider becomes the observer becomes the strategist, and the strategist becomes someone capable of existing beyond the need for approval, reshaping rejection into a foundation for clarity, resilience, and self-determined identity. One of the most profound consequences of lifelong rejection in the psychological journey of Tyrion Lannister is not merely resilience, but the gradual emergence of an independent moral framework. In the world of Game of Thrones, morality is often dictated by lineage, loyalty, and power. Yet Tyrion's exclusion from these traditional anchors forces him to construct his ethical perspective outside inherited norms. Because he is never fully embraced by the systems that define legitimacy, he learns early that belonging and righteousness are not synonymous. Those who claim honor often act with cruelty, while those dismissed as inferior frequently display empathy and integrity. This contradiction becomes central to his moral awakening. Instead of accepting dominant values as universal truths, he begins to question the foundations upon which they rest. Rejection thus becomes a catalyst for ethical independence. He cannot rely on tradition to define justice, because tradition has never protected him. This leads to a deeper sensitivity toward the suffering of others who exist outside accepted hierarchies. He recognizes that exclusion often has little to do with merit and much to do with conformity. Empathy emerges not as an abstract ideal, but as a lived understanding of vulnerability. Having endured humiliation, he becomes less inclined to perpetuate it. His decisions increasingly reflect a commitment to minimizing unnecessary harm rather than preserving prestige. Power, in his view, becomes a tool rather than an entitlement. This shift distinguishes him from those who seek dominance as validation of their worth. Instead, he approaches leadership as stewardship, shaped by the awareness that authority can easily become oppression. His outsider status allows him to question practices others accept without scrutiny. Punishment, loyalty, and justice are no longer measured by tradition alone, but evaluated through their human consequences. He becomes capable of holding complexity without resorting to absolutism. Enemies are not always villains, and allies are not always virtuous. This nuanced understanding challenges the binary thinking common within systems of power. Rejection, which once isolated him, now informs a broader moral imagination. He sees dignity not as something granted by status, but as inherent to human existence. This belief influences his approach to governance, encouraging restraint over vengeance. Where others pursue glory, he pursues stability. Where others seek legacy, he seeks functionality. His ethical framework evolves from survival into responsibility. He begins to act not merely to protect himself, but to prevent the suffering he understands intimately. Marginalization thus becomes the foundation of a moral perspective grounded in empathy rather than entitlement. Through this evolution, rejection does more than shape personality. It reshapes conscience. In the end, Tyrion's greatest transformation lies not in overcoming exclusion, but in allowing it to refine his understanding of justice. He does not emerge from rejection untouched. He emerges informed, and in that knowledge, he becomes capable of exercising power without surrendering humanity.